Millionaire finds young man working at a construction site. The image of his son lost 12 years ago. Harrison Sterling had arrived at that construction site the way he arrived at all the others, in a suit, polished shoes, and a closed-off expression. His construction company was responsible for a new development in a town in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he had a habit of showing up unannounced. He said it was to maintain quality. But those who knew him knew it was because he couldn't stand being stuck inside an office. It was 6 in the evening when he parked his car in front of the site. The sun was low, casting that golden light that makes everything look like an old photograph. He greeted the engineer in charge, grabbed the visitor's hard hat that was kept in the container, and walked into the work site. He did what he always did, went along checking the columns, inspecting the alignment of the beams, reading the progress with his own eyes. It was at a turn in one of the structural corridors that he stopped. There, with his back to him, a young man was hammering a wooden form. Orange vest, yellow hard hat, broad shoulders, upright posture even with the heavy work. He was around 30, maybe a little older, and when he turned around, sensing someone behind him, Harrison brought his hand to his mouth without realizing it. The face. That young man's face was the face of the son he had lost 12 years ago. He didn't just look like him, he was identical. Harrison stood frozen for a few seconds that felt like an hour. The young man looked at him, not understanding the reaction, held the hammer with both hands, and waited. The engineer accompanying Harrison also stopped, not knowing what was going on. "Are you all right, sir?" the engineer asked quietly. Harrison didn't answer right away. He kept staring at the young worker's face, the dark eyes, the slightly square jaw. The right eyebrow with a small, almost imperceptible scar, exactly in the same spot where Julian had gotten a stitch at age 8 after falling off his bike. He took a deep breath. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse. "You can keep going." But as he continued the walk through, he couldn't stop looking back. His name was Caleb Vance. He was 31 years old and had been working in construction since he was 18. He was efficient, punctual, and respected among his co-workers. The site foreman praised him before Harrison even asked, said he was the best mason on the team, that he understood structure better than many certified engineers. Harrison listened to all of it with an attention the foreman didn't understand, but he didn't question it. That night in his hotel room in Chicago, Harrison didn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The images came back in a way he couldn't control. Julian at 15 sitting at the dinner table, Julian asking to try out for Chicago's soccer team, Julian with that boyish expression trying to look like an adult. And then the image he had carried for 12 years, the empty house, the room too tidy to have been abandoned, and a backpack that disappeared along with his son. Julian had disappeared at 16. And no matter how much Harrison knew that time had passed, that the boy would be a man now, he had never stopped picturing his face. He had never stopped asking the mirror whether he would be able to recognize his son if he ever found him. And now the question had an answer he was afraid to believe. Harrison had married Eleanor when they were both 25. She was the principal of a private school, and he had just started his construction company. The early years were good, but work slowly ate away the time they had for family. Harrison traveled too much, was away too much, and when he came home there was always something urgent to deal with on his phone. Julian grew up watching his father walk through the living room without ever really stopping. When Julian disappeared, Eleanor told Harrison that he needed to look at himself before searching for his son anywhere else. He took it as an accusation. They fought bitterly, and 3 months after the disappearance, the marriage ended the same way the boy had gone, without fanfare, without noise, with a metaphorical backpack and a silence neither of them knew how to fill. Harrison built the rest of his life on work because it was the only place where he knew what to do. The construction company grew, the money came, but at no point did he stop looking for Julian. He hired people specialized in locating missing persons. He filed police reports. He sent photos to different states. Nothing. As if the boy had dissolved into thin air on that day in September. And now that young man in the orange vest was hammering away at the construction site Harrison himself had hired him for. The next morning, he went back to the site earlier than usual. He arrived before the sun really heated up, when most of the workers were still having coffee in the shack. Caleb was there, sharpening a tool outside. Harrison approached with more care than he ever had with anything in his life. "Good morning," he said. Caleb looked up. "Good morning, sir. You can call me Harrison. I own the construction company. I know who you are." Caleb didn't say it with harshness. He said it with the naturalness of someone who simply states the truth. The foreman mentioned it yesterday. Harrison stood there for a second, not knowing where to begin. It was the kind of situation there was no manual for. He, who negotiated million-dollar contracts without his voice shaking, was frozen in front of a young man in an orange vest because he was afraid of hearing an answer. "Are you from around here?" he finally asked. "No, I'm from a town in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 120 miles from here. I came for this job 3 weeks ago." "Is your whole family from there?" Caleb paused. It wasn't the pause of someone thinking about an answer. It was the pause of someone realizing the question carries weight. "My adoptive family, yes." Harrison felt his heart beat differently. "Adoptive?" "I was raised by Mr. Arthur and Mrs. Martha. They took me in when I was 17. They're my family. I don't have any other." "And before 17, Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, not from anger, but from something that must have been well practiced inside him, the way of politely closing a door. "Before 17 is a story I don't tell just anyone." He picked up his tool and stood. "Excuse me, sir. The work's waiting." Harrison stood there watching him walk away. And then he did the only thing he could do in that moment. He let him go. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That night, Harrison called Eleanor. They had a civil relationship after the divorce. Neither of them had remarried. They talked every now and then, especially on the dates that had marked them both. Julian's birthday, Christmas, that September every year that they both lived differently but felt the same. Eleanor answered on the second ring. That already said something. She never answered on the second ring. "Harrison." Her voice was cautious. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." Silence. "I saw a young man today at a construction site. Harrison. He's 31 years old, dark eyes, square jaw, and he has a scar on his right eyebrow." The silence on the other end grew heavy in a different way. Harrison heard her breathing change. "Are you telling me that I don't know? Maybe I want it so badly that I'm seeing something that isn't there." He paused. "But Eleanor, I've never been one to see things that aren't there. You know that." She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had that little crack he knew so well. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. He's not easy to open up to." "But I have a construction project to run, so I have time." "Harrison," she said, and the way she said his name carried everything they had been through together, the good and the painful. "If it's him, it's going to be very hard. You understand that, right? It won't be simple." "I know," he said. It was never simple with Julian. 2 weeks went by. 2 weeks of Harrison showing up at the site more often than any project would justify. The engineer thought it was micromanagement. The foreman thought there was some problem with the contract. No one imagined the truth. Harrison took it slow. He learned Caleb's way. Direct, no beating around the bush, no patience for talk that went nowhere. He went slowly. He started by stopping by at lunchtime, a comment about the work, an observation about the structure that gave Caleb room to offer an opinion. And Caleb did, because when it came to work, he spoke without reservation. It was on a Thursday that the conversation changed tone. Harrison had shown the plans for a new phase of the project, and Caleb had made an observation that even the engineer had missed. Harrison looked at him with that expression he couldn't quite hide. "Have you ever thought about going into engineering? You've got the mind for it." Caleb set the plans on the makeshift table in the container and shrugged. "I thought about it when I was younger. It didn't work out." "Why?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, and this time the door didn't close so fast. "I had a stretch in my life when I lost a lot," he said slowly. "I spent a few months adrift, not even knowing where I'd sleep. When Mr. Arthur found me, I was 17 and I didn't even know where I was from, literally. It took me about 2 years to remember some things." Harrison went completely still. You didn't remember where you were from? I remembered fragments. A house. A woman who must have been my mother. Once I remembered the name of a park. But I never went looking. Mr. Arthur and Mrs. Martha were already my family. I had a job, a life, going after a past that had left me on the street. He shook his head. Didn't seem like it would bring me anything good. There was a silence between them that lasted longer than any silence should last in an ordinary conversation. Look, I need to take a breath here for a second, because that moment of Harrison hearing that, imagine spending 12 years looking for someone and then sitting next to that person, and they don't know who you are, and you know that if you make a wrong move, you'll lose everything again. It's not easy even to tell. And if someone had been looking for you all that time, Harrison asked in a voice he controlled as best he could. Caleb looked at him for a second longer than normal. Someone was looking for me. The question came straight, no beating around the bush. I don't know if you're who I think you are, Caleb, but if you are, I need you to know that yes, someone was. The silence that settled after that had a different texture from everything that had happened between the two of them up to that point. Caleb stood still, hard hat in hand, staring at the packed dirt floor of the site. When he raised his head, his eyes held an expression Harrison recognized even after 12 years, the mix of fear and needing to know. Who do you think I am? Caleb asked. My son. 2 words, and they changed the air of the entire site. Caleb didn't react with tears or anger. He just stood there. He took 2 deep breaths, and then he said, You're going to have to prove that to me. I know, Harrison said, and I will. What came after was complicated in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Harrison asked for a paternity test. Caleb agreed after 2 days of silence, in a short conversation in which he said he needed to think. When he came back to talk, he said only, I'll do it, but I'm not going to build up any expectations. The results took more than a week in which Harrison kept showing up at the site, but the 2 of them had less to say. Something had changed. The possibility of an answer had made the air harder to breathe. Eleanor asked to go to Chicago. Harrison said it was too early. She didn't like it, but she respected it. The result arrived on a Tuesday morning on Harrison's phone, 99.8%. He sat in the car in front of the hotel for 40 minutes before he could move. He read the number about 5 times. He sent a message to Eleanor. It's him. She called within seconds, and on the other end, he only heard her crying in silence. That cry of someone who had held in a lot for a long time. Then he went to the construction site. Caleb was working when Harrison arrived. The foreman called him over, and the 2 went to the container. Harrison placed the printed result on the table without saying anything. Caleb picked up the paper, read it again. He stood with the paper in his hand for a length of time Harrison couldn't measure. So you're my father? It wasn't a question. I am. Caleb folded the paper carefully, almost slowly, and put it in the pocket of his vest. Then he looked at Harrison with those dark eyes, the same ones from when he was 16, and said something Harrison wasn't prepared to hear. Why did I leave? Harrison opened his mouth and closed it. It was the question he had answered to himself in 1,000 different ways over 12 years, and none of the answers had ever felt satisfying. I don't know everything, he said honestly. You left one day without saying a word. Your mother and I had fought. There was tension at home, but I never knew what made you leave. Did you come after me? I did everything I could. I filed a police report. I hired whoever I could. I went in person to several places. I did that for years. But you didn't find me. I didn't find you. Caleb nodded slowly, as if processing it all at his own pace. Does my mother know? She already knows I found you. She wants to come see you. He crossed his arms. I need time. You can have all the time you need. And I'm not leaving my job halfway. I have a commitment here. Caleb, Harrison said with a firm but gentle voice, I didn't come here to demand anything from you. I came to tell you who you are. What you do with that is your choice. Those were 4 difficult days. Caleb worked normally, greeted Harrison politely when they crossed paths, but didn't start conversations. Harrison respected that. He stayed in town, took care of the construction, waited. On Thursday night, Caleb knocked on the door of the hotel room. Harrison opened the door and stayed quiet. For the first time, Caleb wasn't in his work uniform. He was in jeans and a white t-shirt, with that look of a young man who grew up fending for himself. A firm posture even when everything inside must be in pieces. "Can I come in?" "Of course." They sat on opposite sides of the bed because it was the only place to sit. And Caleb began to talk. He said he remembered a big fight at home. He remembered his father's voice on the phone while his mother cried in the kitchen. He remembered thinking no one would notice if he disappeared for a few days. He had gone to the house of a friend who lived in another town, but the friend had moved away, and Caleb had arrived in a place where he knew no one, no money, no way of knowing how to get back, and the pride of a 16-year-old that kept him from asking for help. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing on. After weeks on the street, something had happened that he still didn't fully understand. A small accident, a blow to the head in a fall, and the months that followed stayed in a fog in his memory. When Mr. Arthur found him, he was on a park bench in a city he had never seen in his life, without documents, without even being sure of his own name. "I remembered they called me Julian," he said, "but I thought it was a dream." It became Caleb because Mrs. Martha had a brother named that, and she said, "I looked like him." Harrison listened to everything without interrupting once. His hand was clenched on his knee with such force that his knuckles turned white, but he stayed quiet. Sometimes listening is the only thing you can do right. "I left because I felt invisible," Caleb said at last. "Not because I didn't like you all, because I thought you wouldn't notice I had gone." That hung in the air for a while. "I noticed," Harrison said. "Your mother noticed, and there wasn't a single day that I didn't know the blame for what you felt was mine too." Caleb looked at him. For the first time in that conversation, he looked directly. "Have you changed?" An honest, unadorned question. "I've aged," Harrison said, "and as we age, we learn what we left behind. I can't promise you I'm perfect, but I can promise you that you won't have to be invisible to me again." Eleanor arrived in Chicago 2 days later. She was 61 years old and wore her age well on her face, not from the time that had passed, but from the life she had lived. She had short hair and attentive eyes, and when she saw Caleb from a distance at the entrance to the construction site, she stopped in the middle of the parking lot and stood still. Caleb stopped too. The two of them stood looking at each other for a long second in that late afternoon light, like two strangers who carry the same memory and still don't know what to do with it. Eleanor walked up to him. Caleb didn't step back. She came close, studied his face, like someone seeking to confirm something she already knows, and said, "You've grown so much." "You haven't changed much," he replied. She laughed. It was a laugh that had tears inside it, the kind that only comes out when you've held too much in for too long. And then she placed her hand on her son's face, with such tenderness that she seemed afraid he would vanish again if she were too forceful. Caleb closed his eyes for a second, just a second, but it was enough. I need to be honest. When I first got to this part of the story, I spent a while looking at it, unable to go on. There are certain things that hit a place we don't even know we have. A mother waiting 12 years to put her hand on her son's face. I don't know about you all, but I needed a second. The following weeks were difficult in a different way. Caleb finished the job at the construction site because he was a man of his word and had made a promise to that crew. Harrison respected that. Eleanor went back to her city, but she called every day. They weren't long conversations. They were the conversations of people learning to talk to someone who had disappeared young and come back an adult. Mr. Arthur and Mrs. Martha found out about the story. Caleb went to tell them in person because that was just how he was. He didn't send word. He faced things head-on. Mr. Arthur, who was 72 and in fragile health, heard the story without blinking. And when Caleb finished, he said, You have blood family and the family that raised you. One doesn't cancel out the other, you understand me?" Caleb said yes, and he said he knew it was true, because only a true family that raised you could raise a man who knew that. Mr. Arthur spent the whole week quieter than usual. Mrs. Martha, who understood her husband better than he understood himself, sat beside him one night and said, "You were afraid of losing him." "I was," he admitted. "But you didn't lose him. You raised a son with a heart big enough for two fathers." And that was that. Harrison met Mr. Arthur and Mrs. Martha 2 months later, on a visit that Caleb organized with more care than any construction project he had ever worked on. They had lunch at their house in a town in the Blue Ridge Mountains with a cobblestone street and a backyard with a lemon tree. Harrison showed up in a suit, which caused a brief moment of awkwardness that lasted exactly as long as it took Mrs. Martha to put a bowl of salad in front of him and say, "Eat first, introductions later." It was the best lunch Harrison had had in years. Mr. Arthur shook Harrison's hand before he left and said he was a man of few words, but he had one thing to say. "Caleb is a good son. If you lost him when he was a boy, now you're going to have to earn the man." Harrison said he knew that, said he was willing. It took months of rebuilding. It wasn't one of those movie-style reconciliations, where in a single weekend everyone cries, hugs, and ends up fine. It was the real kind of rebuilding, the slow kind, the kind with setbacks. There was a big argument when Caleb found out Harrison had stopped searching 6 years after the disappearance. Caleb saw it as a betrayal. Harrison tried to explain that the search had continued in another form, in a different way. But yes, at a certain point he'd understood he needed to keep living. Caleb left angry after that conversation. He went 3 weeks without calling. Harrison didn't call either. He let his son breathe. When Caleb finally called back, the first thing he said was, "I understand. It just took me a while." "That's good enough," Harrison said. Eleanor and Caleb took longer to find their rhythm. She carried a guilt she couldn't name, the kind of guilt that isn't about anything specific, but about a series of small choices that, added together, created an environment a 16-year-old boy didn't know how to face. She was honest with Caleb about that in a conversation the two of them had alone, without Harrison, on an ordinary afternoon. Caleb listened, and then he said, "You don't need to apologize for being human. You just need to be my mother from where we are now." Eleanor said she'd try. "Don't try," he said. "You already are." By the end of a year, things weren't perfect. Caleb lived in the town in the Blue Ridge Mountains with Mr. Arthur and Mrs. Martha, but he visited his birth parents with a regularity that grew slowly, like a plant taking root in new soil, unhurried, but steady. Harrison learned to call before showing up. Eleanor learned that her son had become a man who didn't need to be saved, only loved. And Caleb learned that the past he'd avoided for so long wasn't a bottomless pit. It was just a story that hadn't reached its ending yet. There was an afternoon when the three of them sat together at a restaurant table in a town halfway between the places where each of them lived. And something small happened that Harrison would tell anyone who would listen for the rest of his life. Caleb was looking at the menu and made a silly joke about the price of a dish, and Eleanor laughed with that laugh of hers that Harrison hadn't heard in who knows how long, and Caleb looked at her with a smirk that was the same smile he'd had at 10 years old. In that moment, Harrison covered his mouth with his hand, just like the day he'd first seen his son at the construction site. But this time it wasn't from shock. It was to hold back an emotion too big to fit into silence. End of story. Sometimes life does something you didn't expect. It finds its way back. Not the way you planned, not in the time you wanted, but it finds it. Harrison and Caleb's story reminded me that the people we lose, even when they seem gone forever, are sometimes just waiting for us to be ready to receive them back in a different way. Tell us what you thought of this story. Do you think Caleb did the right thing by opening that door? And if you were him, would you have come faster or slower? Leave it in the comments. We read everything. A big hug. Thank you so much for staying until the end. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.